Hi everyone, welcome to a new installment of our ICUB Workshops in Understanding. It is May 26, 2021, and they're called ICUB Workshops in Understanding because the general topic is understanding in both epistemology, phil mind, phil science, and because they're hosted by ICUB. This is the Research Institute at the University of Bucharest, and um, um, we're delighted to be sponsored by the local public funding agency for research, USAMV, and this is via project PN-3 Roman-PD-1.1-2019-0535, and we're very grateful to our public sponsor for their support. Tonight, we have a thought-provoking presentation from Mihai Rusu. Dr. Rusu joins us from Universitatea de Științe Agricole și Medicină Veterinară Cluj-Napoca, and also from Babeș-Bolyai University, also in Cluj-Napoca. And his talk is titled Modal Knowledge and the Sources of Modality. Mihai, we're delighted that you could join us, and please take it away.
Okay, Andre, thank you very much for your presentation and also for your very interesting, for your invitation to take part in this very interesting and stimulating series of talks. Yeah, so I'm very happy to be here, very happy to see all the participants again, most of them. And I thank them also for taking part in my talk. Hope I won't bore you too much with my story. As I said before to everyone here, it's part of, it's very much work in progress, and it's part of a wider, larger interest in some issues pertaining to the epistemology of modality, connected with the main topic of your series of talks, which is understanding. So I'll be talking today mostly about the counterfactual epistemology of Williamson. I hope everybody sees me and sees the screen all right. Yes, everything is okay. You can hear me, you can see me. All right, so the counterfactual epistemology of Williamson has been one of the most hotly debated contemporary accounts in modal epistemology. And despite the ample attention this theory has received, I contend that one fundamental problem of Williamson's epistemology has not been discussed conclusively in the literature. So besides diagnosing the problem in its specific articulation in Williamson's work, I aim to show that this difficulty is the symptom of a more general concern that affects many realist accounts of modality. In what follows, I describe briefly Williamson's view on the connection between counterfactuals and metaphysical modality. Then I will discuss the main requirements that an adequate realist epistemology of modality must fulfill. And I put into perspective some of the criticism that Williamson's theory and other accounts have received. I will proceed to a description of Williamson's view of understanding, which I subsequently apply to modal expressions. In the following section, so the following section contains the full explication of the tension that appears when we attempt to integrate Williamson's perspective from the philosophy of language with his very demanding epistemology of metaphysical necessity. An investigation of other realist accounts encounters similar quandaries. The final part will attempt a reappraisal of the tension from the perspective of important tasks and solutions that have been hitherto overlooked or minimized in modal epistemology. So very briefly, what's Williamson's account of modal knowledge? So he aims to give an account of our knowledge of modality that is grounded in our ordinary cognitive capacities. The main thesis of this account is that our capacity to handle metaphysical modality, that is to form modal knowledge, is a byproduct of our natural ability to develop and entertain counterfactual suppositions. So Williamson argues that the following relations hold between metaphysical modalities and counterfactual conditionals. On the one hand, you have it is necessary A, that is equivalent to not A, counterfactually implies, that's the sign for counterfactual implication. counterfactual implies a contradiction, and possible A, that's for P, is equivalent to it is not true that A counterfactual implies a contradiction. So in Williamson's own words, we assert necessary A when our counterfactual development of the supposition not A robustly yields a contradiction. And we assert possible A when our counterfactual development of the supposition A does not robustly yield a contradiction. While the relation between modalities and counterfactuals is given in terms of an equivalence, in the order of explanation, counterfactuals are prior, as Williamson holds that the epistemology of metaphysically modal thinking is tantamount to a special case of the epistemology of counterfactual thinking. That's from his book, The Philosophy of Philosophy. So first of all, what is ontological realism about metaphysical modality? Quite simply, I take ontological realism about modality to be any view according to which modal truth is objective. That is, there are modal facts or a modal reality that are mind independent. Naturally, it would not make much sense if one were to uphold such a view without also believing that we have knowledge of at least some such modal truths. Realism about modality should and does extend from metaphysics to epistemology. In this sense, Williamson is an ontological realist about modality. In what follows, I'll propose a list of requirements that an epistemology of metaphysical modality must fulfill in order to provide an acceptable account of modal knowledge from a realist standpoint. The list may be incomplete or the requirements may overlap to some extent, yet every desideratum, I think, exhibits a different reason for formulating and structuring modal epistemology in a certain way. These requirements should clarify why some accounts are successful, but I think the requirements are even more useful for explaining the failure of certain accounts or for the dissatisfaction some thinkers feel in relation to various theories. So here are the requirements for a serious, let's call it, modal epistemology. So 1, modal epistemology should explain our knowledge of a distinctive type of metaphysical modality, not reducible in any sense to other types, such as logical or conceptual or even natural modality. The famous examples of necessary a posteriori truths from Kripke appear to provide us such putative cases, in my opinion. Then modal epistemology should justify knowledge of metaphysical necessity, which is a distinct task. I think that from then accounting is a distinct task from accounting for knowledge of metaphysical possibility. Third, modal epistemology should account for our knowledge of sufficiently many modal claims in general. We could call them typical, it's not important. I put the brackets there because it's kind of hard to say what is a typical modal claim, or what is a typical claim of possibility or of necessity. But you would want, let's call it, not extraordinary, non-extraordinary modal claims to be accounted for, and most of them, sufficiently many, to be accounted for in a modal epistemology. 4, modal epistemology should clarify at least some cases of extraordinary modal claims, including necessary a posteriori truths. And 5, which is the most controversial of them all, clearly this is not a general constraint on epistemology of modality, but I also think that modal epistemology, realist modal epistemology, should attribute a certain robustness to modal statements or modal notions. One wants modal truth explained, I say, but not explained away. So, as I said above, the list contains reasons for the success, but more importantly for the failure of some theories. I will now elaborate a little on these requirements and illustrate how we can use them to assess the merits or rather the shortcomings of some epistemological theories about modality. So requirement 1 is needed in order to account for a type of modality that is not grounded in anything that may be regarded as ultimately conceptual or theoretical. Kripke's cases of necessary a posteriori truths, such as the identity of Hesperus and Phosphorus, various purportedly essential properties such as origin or composition, are widely considered as successful examples of such a distinctive type of modality. That is called metaphysical or real or absolute modality sometimes. Epistemological theories may assign too much weight to one, therefore engendering a certain type of circularity of justification. That is, they take examples of metaphysical modalities, such as Kripke's, as being established beyond controversy or criticism. But these cases remain putative, both metaphysically and epistemologically. Theories are then formulated in order to accommodate these purported metaphysical truths that we are also supposed to have knowledge of. I contend it should be the other way around. A circularity charge has also been leveled by Bogosian against Williamson's account. This circularity, if it exists, is connected, I think, to a need to fulfill something more than requirement one in Williamson's case. The most daunting challenge for an epistemology of modality remains accounting for our knowledge of necessity, metaphysical necessity, in the case of the epistemology of metaphysical modality, of course. Sorry. Apparently, the fact that possibility and necessity are interdefinable should make matters easier. But this does not happen. The temptation is to think that once we have an epistemology of possibility, we should also have an epistemology of necessity because of the interdefinability of the two notions. And of course, an epistemology of possibility seems like a rather simple task, as we have an uncontroversial and knowable stock of possible truths to start from, the actually true statements. However, accounting for metaphysical necessity is a different and much more strenuous task than accounting for metaphysical possibility. Imagination-based modal epistemology is typically the most burdened, as we seem able to entertain in an apparently coherent way counterexamples to various truths that philosophers deem metaphysically necessary. One can, Pace Kripke, imagine a table made of wood being made of plastic, or of a different type of wood, or of different chunks of wood, and so on, at least when one does not know what the table is made of. This lack of limitations of our imagination creates a different type of circularity in modal epistemology. Imagination-based accounts have an inborn tendency to become error theories. Their main purpose being not to describe and explain modal knowledge, but rather to explain modal illusions. That is the reason why some, but not all, of our imaginings should not count as counterexamples to purportedly necessary truths. The trouble is that this theoretical enforcement of restrictions to our imagination is made in order to salvage certain intuitions or a certain established view, but appears ultimately ineffective and artificial, as I will try to show later. This is also, I gather, the type of circularity that is imputed to Williamson's epistemology. While Williamson's account is not solely imagination-based, it runs into the same trouble that imagination-based epistemology encounters. No contradiction is apparent in counterfactual scenarios that contain impossible situations. For example, there is no contradiction if we suppose that the Queen is the daughter of Ernest Hemingway, and then build a counterfactual scenario accordingly, or that gold has a different atomic number from the one it actually has, and so on. So Williamson's view of the nature of imagination is that it typically proceeds as realistically as it can, and thus it may exploit all our background knowledge. Still, this is not enough in order to yield a contradiction. So Williamson's solution to this quandary is encapsulated in the passage that you see on the slide. If we know enough chemistry, our counterfactual development of the supposition that gold is the element with atomic number other than 79 will generate a contradiction. The reason is not simply that we know that gold is the element with atomic number 79, for we can and must verify some items of our knowledge under counterfactual suppositions. Rather, part of the general way we develop counterfactual suppositions is to hold such constitutive facts fixed. Of course, the emphasis is mine there, and that's an important part that I will talk about shortly. So, circularity would arise for the counterfactual epistemology of Williamson because apparently one has to know already what is metaphysically necessary in order to know what to hold fixed across counterfactual scenarios. Williamson has replied by claiming that his is not a reductive account, which means that it cannot be circular in the sense that modalities would actually be reduced to themselves by way of counterfactuals. I think that Williamson's reply is successful, at least from a technical standpoint, but I will try to formulate a different type of criticism that is effective even if we take Williamson's account to be non-reductive. So as for requirements 3 and 4, I will not discuss them in detail here, as I hope they are clear and intuitive. Of course, we want most of what we consider modal truths, typical modal truths, to be accounted for in our theory. For instance, we want something like me being in Rome today. I wish I were in Rome. Perhaps I am. You have no way of checking that. So even though I'm not actually there, of course, I want that to be a possible truth that is also knowable. So perspectives may vary on what we regard as typical modal truth, and theories may again give rise to circularity, but there is no need to dwell on this further. As for the requirement 4, I submitted a modal epistemologist should want to account not only for the typical, but also for the extraordinary. Van Inwagen gives some examples of such extraordinary modal claims, such as the possibility of immaterial beings, of transparent iron, and so on. I contend that Kripke's examples of necessary a posteriori truths are also extraordinary in the sense that they need theoretical clarification or elaboration, much in the same way that the possibility or impossibility of a zombie or of a disembodied mind does. Modal epistemologists fail here by accepting implausible modal truths or by discarding plausible ones. This is caused by a more subtle but ever-present pitfall of modal epistemology, that of accepting implausible restrictions or incorporating too much content in the theory in order to accommodate our intuitions or objectives. So finally, requirement 5, may be seen as a rather controversial addition to the list. Even if one believes that the concept of metaphysical modality lacks robustness, one can still be a realist about this type of modality, granted, that's for sure. So one may believe that it represents something objective in our world without representing something objective in a robust manner, something that cannot be reduced to other types of notions. However, there would be not much use in maintaining such a view. If metaphysical modality is reducible to other notions, then its philosophical importance seems rather thin. And the debate surrounding it, the ample debate surrounding metaphysical modality seem rather pointless. Counterfactual epistemologies of modality may assume this lack of robustness of traditional modal concepts, as Kment does, for example, or may attempt to work their way around it, as Williamson does. An emphasis on the non-reductive nature of Williamson's account works as a rejection not only of circularity charges, but also of possible counter-arguments concerning the lack of robustness of modal notions. To be fair, though, the gist of many of the critiques that have been formulated against Williamson is not that his modal concepts are deficient, but rather that knowledge of metaphysical modality is already needed in order to entertain epistemically efficient counterfactual scenarios. If it is not metaphysical modality that grounds itself via counterfactuals, then it is constitutive knowledge which does the job, as Roca-Royes and Tafco argue, for instance. But then we do not need the mediation of counterfactuals, as constitutive knowledge already has the modal consequences we are in search of. As said above, my critique of Williamson's account will follow a slightly different line. So what's Williamson's account of understanding? I won't delve too much on the technical details because they are not important, only the gist, the main idea, the main point of Williamson is important here. So it's not a question or a controversy regarding quantification, but rather a general point that he makes in relation to quantificational expressions. So before proposing his counterfactual epistemology of modality, Williamson argues in his lectures against the view that mere linguistic competence, that is understanding of a statement, is apt to provide insight into the truth of that statement. As we will see, Williamson's requirements on understanding are minimal. In order to understand Williamson's view better, I will discuss here only a fragment of his case from the philosophy of philosophy, that is his Peter and Stephen examples, that purport to show that the understanding assent link breaks down even in the case of analytic statements. So there Williamson considers an example of an uncontroversial logical truth. Every vixen is a vixen. There are two deviant cases, let's call them, Peter and Stephen, who hold views of quantification that are different from the standard one. Peter believes that the universal quantifier is existence committing. So for one to be true, there has to exist at least one vixen. Stephen, in his turn, believes that borderline cases constitute truth value gaps. So one cannot be true if vixen is a vague notion. Yet Williamson argues that Peter and Stephen's deviant beliefs do not make them understand quantificational expressions differently from the community of English language speakers. Their word, every, has the same meaning as what we mean by every. Peter and Stephen are part of the linguistic community and engage in fruitful linguistic interactions with other speakers. Even if their views on quantifiers are incorrect, they have learned words like every in the same way most of the members of the linguistic community have. So as Williamson puts it, the argument that Peter and Stephen mean what we mean by their words exemplifies two interlocking themes. Those are Quine's epistemological holism, on which the epistemological status of a belief constitutively depends on its position in the believer's whole system of beliefs, and Putnam and Burge's semantic externalism, on which the content of a belief constitutively depends on the believer's position in a society of believers. So epistemological holism explains how an orthodoxy on one point can be compensated for by orthodoxy on many others. So that overall, Peter and Stephen's usage of the key terms is not beyond the pale of social acceptability, since they remain participants in the relevant linguistic practice. Semantic externalism then explains how they can still use the terms with their normal public senses. But neither epistemological holism nor semantic externalism figured as premises of the argument. Rather, the argument appealed to features of the relevant systems of belief that make epistemological holism plausible, and to features of our ascription of beliefs that make semantic externalism plausible. This fragment shows the main features and sources of Williamson's minimal view of understanding. Of course, there is much to be discussed regarding understanding, linguistic competence, and their relations to the views or theories we have about language. This type of discussion is, for instance, present nowadays in the debate surrounding the experimental philosophy of language. One important thread in the critique of the importance of some experimental results for philosophy of language has been precisely this. It does not matter what theories about language reference in particular speakers prefer. Language use is not connected to implicit or explicit assent to a certain theory about language or to having certain metalinguistic intuitions. Now, I do not intend to seek an adjudication of these controversies in this talk. Nevertheless, the point I will now make seems to show that matters are not as simple as Williamson's picture makes them look. The reason is rather straightforward. An underdetermination of meaning may lead to an underdetermination of fundamental notions and the theories we build with or for them. So let's try to apply Williamson's theory of understanding to the understanding of modal expressions. The first question that must be posed is the following. Are there examples analogous to Peter and Stephen in the case of modal expressions? Well, there most certainly are. There are Willard and David and an older Hillary and others who hold philosophically unorthodox views regarding modalities. Then we should also know that everyday uses of modal expressions are not carefully distinguished or unitary, and if, as Williamson himself notices, division of linguistic labor cannot save the day in Peter and Stephen-like cases, then for similar reasons, it cannot do much for modalities either. My strategy here is to assess the impact Williamson's view of understanding has on the status of modal notions that the same Williamson aims to defend robustly, I should say. So let's apply Williamson's own lessons to modality. Modalities are, of course, designed by expressions in language. So according to Williamson's view, one does not need the correct beliefs about modality in order to use modal expressions correctly. But remember now that the constraints on counterfactual suppositions that we purportedly need for obtaining metaphysical necessity are, according to Williamson, general. Constitutive facts are held fixed across all scenarios, in all cases, by all moderately knowledgeable members of the linguistic community. That is according to Williamson. But how do we know that these constraints are in fact general? If they are not, then counterfactuals will not suffice to provide an explanation of our knowledge of metaphysical modality, not by Williamson's slides, at least. So which counterfactual practice is dominant? If modalities arise one way or another from counterfactual practice, it is not clear in Williamson's account how that happens precisely, but I won't insist on these issues here. Then it is of the utmost importance what type of counterfactual practice is dominant. If we follow Williamson's account, the dominant way of setting up counterfactual suppositions should also determine the meaning of our modal expressions. Roca-Royes has attempted an answer to this question by comparing two epistemologies of counterfactuals that are Williamson's W and EC, which proceeds much like Williamson's account, but does not require that we hold constitutive facts fixed across all scenarios. According to Roca-Royes, EC is efficient as an epistemology of counterfactuals and is more plausible from a naturalistic perspective. I will not focus on Roca-Royes' arguments here, but her paper shows at least that there may be different accounts of counterfactual practice that explain it efficiently without acquiescing to Williamson's more radical tenets. So what Roca-Royes does not do, however, is provide a definitive answer to the question which counterfactual practice is dominant. Whichever answer is the right one, it should be rather clear that we cannot proceed only by doing armchair philosophy at this point. Counterfactual development practices should be investigated, but both for laymen and experts. And criteria should be proposed for deciding which methods are preeminent when these practices diverge for different groups, experts and non-experts, different classes of experts, etc. Naturally, not all types of notions should be treated the same way. Modal notions are nevertheless a case where a clear-cut answer is not readily available. Neither Williamson nor Roca-Royes provide sufficient reasons for deciding their account is better. So what is the main tension I appear to see in Williamson's account? There is a deeper cause, I think, of the dissatisfaction one may feel when confronted with the counterfactual epistemology of modality. An underlying tension must be resolved, and not only in Williamson's case. The general tension is between an objectivist or a realist view of metaphysical modality and a view that makes meaning or understanding universally dependent on social practices. My aim is not to show that this tension is unsolvable, but rather to characterize this difficulty more thoroughly as regards mainly Williamson's epistemology of counterfactuals. So what happens when we apply the moral of the Peter and Stephen cases to modal concepts? If the meaning of metaphysical modal terms is dependent on linguistic practices, then it is also dependent on the capacity of the community to develop the right kind of modal concept. That is the one that represents modal reality. Again, we are talking about realist theories of modality. So a concept that represents modal reality, that is the real modal properties of objects and not something that our mind or cognitive faculties impose on or add to the world. While it is ultimately inconsequential to our view of the world, which is the actual use of a quantifier or of a conditional expression, not the same can be said about modal expressions. But the question is, does any discussion about correctness make sense? Whatever social externalism seems to teach us is that the right concept is the one that can be drawn from use. So in our case, if Roca-Royes' minimalist counterfactuals are dominant, then the right kind of metaphysical necessity is whatever necessity we can form out of this type of counterfactuals. In order to make this point clearer, I will make a brief detour into other accounts and their own troubles, which I regard as related to the one Williamson's account faces. For instance, imagination-based accounts, typical imagination-based accounts, are affected by what I will just simply call the problem of too much content. It is obvious that the imagination often goes beyond the lines drawn by the purportedly essential properties of things, and thus provides an unsatisfactory guide to modality for realists, at least. The solution is then to restrain the imagination in accordance with some criteria that, unsurprisingly, end up in providing us with precisely what we need in order to justify some previous modal intuitions. If necessity of origin or of composition must be accommodated, Kripke just proposes that we do that by positing that we cannot imagine something that violates these intuitions. Given that the lectern is in fact not made of ice, it is in fact made of wood, one cannot imagine that under certain circumstances it could have been made of ice. That is from Identity and Necessity. This is not the only passage where Kripke appears to propose such a radical solution, but the constraint seems either ineffective because it kind of looks ad hoc, most plausibly, or it is too strong. If the restriction works, which is doubtful, then it goes against orthodox Kripkean intuitions about necessary a posteriori truths by seemingly transforming every necessary truth into an a priori one, or something very much like an a priori truth. To see this better, we can examine Jackson's criticism of the idea that there are metaphysical impossibilities that are nevertheless conceptually possible. So in Language, Names, and Information, Jackson discusses various related issues. He says the following: many who hold that the constitution of an object is an essential property of it argue that some particular objects not being made of wood, in the case where it is in fact made of wood, is metaphysically impossible. Suppose they are right. Should we then say that a possible world where this very table, the one I'm now writing on, which is made of wood, is not made of wood, is an example of a world that is conceptually possible but metaphysically impossible? No. For what makes the table in the claimed conceptually possible world where it is not made of wood this very table? If a table's constitution is an essential property of it, part of the answer must be it's being made of wood. But then, the world said to be conceptually possible is no such thing. A table made of wood, not being made of wood, is conceptually impossible. Now, this is rather controversial, and Jackson does not push his idea to its ultimate conclusion. But if there are no metaphysical impossibilities that are conceptually possible, and if we take, as it is traditionally done, conceptual possibility or necessity to mean a priori possibility or necessity, then a metaphysical impossibility must also be an a priori impossibility. And a metaphysical necessity must be an a priori necessity. This seems the natural consequence of such a restriction on the imagination. Now, although I see no other way to restrict the imagination effectively in the way proposed by Kripke than to transform every constitutive knowledge into a priori knowledge, many of the people I have discussed this Jackson-Rusu argument, let's call it, seem to be less impressed than I am by its radical conclusions. So nevertheless, it is not essential for my point here that the constitutive knowledge is or becomes a priori, but rather that the restriction restricts too much, so to say, by assigning too much force to our recognition of necessary truths. Perhaps imagination is too fickle, and the problem can be solved by appealing to a more serious faculty, let's call it, all the while acknowledging but also limiting the role of the a priori. The modal rationalism of Peacock is another philosophical doctrine that is inspired by Kripke's suggestions and that aims to provide an answer to the predicaments of modal epistemology. So if we define rationalism as the view that modal knowledge is underpinned by a priori principles, then according to modal rationalism, or modal intuitions about necessity of origin, necessity of composition, etc., are encapsulated in a priori principles that determine the content of modal concepts. But a modal rationalist, such as Peacock, also wants to be a realist about modality, which means that the principles must align with modal facts, as opposed to a certain conceptual scheme. Now, what the critiques of modal rationalists proposed by Crispin Wright and by Sonia Roca-Royes also show is that if modal notions are defined by the principles associated with them, every change in the principles determines a different modal notion. So a different type of modal truth at the end. Nevertheless, if one is a realist, there must be one correct modal notion. But then the question I put forth at the beginning of this section of my talk reappears under a different form. How do we know that the most frequent modal doctrine, according to modal rationalism, the most frequent conjunction of principles about modality, how do we know that that is the correct modal doctrine or modal theory? So after this detour, let's reappraise the tension now regarding specifically Williamson's account. So does the same problem appear in the case of the counterfactual epistemology of Williamson? Yes, if modal notions are defined or just produced by our counterfactual practices. According to Williamson, constitutive knowledge makes you just say stop whenever we entertain a metaphysical impossibility in a counterfactual development. Contradiction appears simply because the imaginer confronts the scenario she imagines, of course, with a stock of constitutive truths she must carry from one scenario to another. So then it is paramount what type of properties are deemed constitutive. Each different doctrine of the constitutive will deliver a difference in counterfactual practice and a different modal concept. Finally, let's return to the role of understanding, the role understanding plays in the argument. Williamson's constraints on understanding are, as we have seen, minimal. Williamson's constraints, on the other hand, on counterfactual supposition are at the same time maximal, or else they cannot bring about modal knowledge, of necessity in particular. But in order to understand modal expressions, that is, use them properly by Williamson's lights, one need not adhere to the strong epistemological constraints or to the same constraints. This means that different notions of metaphysical necessity may coexist along with different counterfactual practices. And the fact that the right modal notion, the one that conforms to modal reality, is dominant, may be felicitous, or simply our modal notion may not be the right one. Division of linguistic labor will not save the day, and the reasons are given by Williamson himself. Metaphysical modal notions are philosophical, which means that if division of linguistic labor is appealed to, as Putnam famously does, laymen should defer to philosophers, at least partially for expertise on modalities. But expert philosophers disagree on these issues, some of them quite radically. Which of the experts' opinions should we choose? Of course, there is no definitive or definite even answer to this question. Moreover, we should point out another complication. If counterfactual practices differ inside the community, then we must also establish which practice takes precedence in establishing the modal properties of objects. Scientists and philosophers may disagree over what must be held fixed in the counterfactual scenarios, much as experts from the same field may also disagree about the same issues. So on to the conclusion. The main aim of this talk was to diagnose a deeper element that is, in my view, responsible for the insufficiency of the counterfactual epistemology as a realist account of modal knowledge. If we attempt to integrate the perspectives of the philosophy of language and epistemology in the spirit of, let's say, Peacock's integration challenge, we see that Williamson's view of understanding and his construal of the nature and role of counterfactuals in providing naturalistic grounding for modal notions are incompatible. One is too weak and the other is too strong. What is the take-home message and what are the perspectives for a successful realist epistemology of modality? Of course, Williamson's account is not the only realist alternative in current literature, and not all theories are bound to run into the problems evinced here. One of Williamson's aims is to flesh out an account that is not solely imagination-based, because imagination is notoriously hard to accommodate for the realist as an absolute source of modal truth. The content of theories and intuitions and various forms of reasoning are appealed to and used in counterfactual developments. The trouble is that this use seems much harder to unify and systematize when we go beyond Williamson's sketch and try to fill in the details. I believe, however, that Williamson is right on this very general issue. Narrative justification seems to be the norm for modal epistemology. But we should want a more specific account which tells us what type of evidence is to be accepted, in which contexts, and for what type of claims. Modal narratives may differ profoundly in relation to the specifics of the content. That is the problem of the source of modality, of multiple and irreducible sources of modal truths that we must acknowledge and characterize adequately. Nevertheless, if there is no metaphysical necessity that is not conceptual, logical, biological, physical, etc., then doubts about the importance of the metaphysical notion are, of course, justified. For robust modal epistemology should include an epistemology of modal discovery, of modal error, and modal disagreement, in order to account for the factual nature of modal statements. If our modal statements are about facts that are independent of our minds, then it is only plausible that we encounter surprises, errors, and disagreements regarding this portion of reality, much as we do regarding other parts of reality. All these phenomena should be explained, and we should be provided with methods or at least guidelines for correcting errors and settling disagreements. This type of inquiry is currently treated very sparsely and collaterally in the literature. Generally, I think more needs to be done to study actual practices and norms for fruitful linguistic exchangings using modal expressions, and also how our modal thinking is shaped and used. In Williamson's case, it should be determined which counterfactual practices are dominant and how they are conducive to modal knowledge. One aspect that must be more thoroughly discussed is philosophical expertise, I think. Perhaps there is an expertise defense available after all. And layman's model thinking and discourse may be deemed unimportant or inconsistent or unsystematic. Maybe we should focus after all on experts. The question is which experts? Use of model notions. This cannot be done, however, if stricter criteria are not imposed on the understanding of certain classes of notions, such as philosophical ones, as metaphysical modalities appear to be. More than 20 years ago, almost 30 years ago, Iablo expressed a similar view. It still remains to be seen if this type of epistemic optimism is warranted. So that is all. Thank you for your patience, and I'm very eager to hear your comments and questions.
Thank you so much, Mihai. This has been so thought-provoking. I invite everyone in the audience to join me in using the all too well-known applause button. We're delighted that you've given us this quite ample perspective, and I wonder if we already have a few questions from the audience.
I think there is something in the chat.
Yeah,
yeah, that's not.
This was just double checking that both the audio and the video stream work well. I would hesitate to jump ahead of queue if Paula, Julia, or Corina would like to ask a question. Please go ahead. Well, if not, let me just break the ice as I invite our colleagues to ponder their own questions. And Mihai, let me just ask you something about the slide that you've titled Conclusions.
Yes, just. Let me just, okay.
Right, so with your permission, this is going to be very half-baked and a very naive question. So I wonder, the second bullet point there is this, and I quote, modal epistemology should include an epistemology of modal discovery, modal error, and modal disagreement to account for whatever. I have a separate question about the putatively factual nature of modal statements, but let's just bracket that. My question, I'm always tempted by various combo picks and various flavors of various views. So my question was why the landscape that you've presented shouldn't give us reason to pause and think to ourselves, well, maybe these are distinct issues. Maybe different epistemologies better fit modal discovery, modal error, and modal disagreement. Why should there be a kind of one-size-fits-all view? So, for instance, just to put it out there, suppose we're trying to ascertain the conceptual modal strength of, say, I don't know, Newton's laws of motion. Okay, and I'm sure this is quite well known, right? At a certain point, Kant thought that these are a priori laws, so he seemed to suggest that, in some sense, once we've been brought into this kind of view, we couldn't imagine anything else, or if we could imagine something that would violate Newton's laws, it wouldn't be genuinely conceivable. It would just be mere imagination or something of the sort, right? So then, suppose let's try to live in Kant's shoes for a moment here, right? And suppose that there's one thing, right? The modal discovery of it, right? The discovery of the laws of motion in question. And there's quite a different thing. Once you've discovered the laws in question, what counts as erroneous and what counts as being on the right track with respect to meeting those laws, right? So it seems that the modal discovery and modal error sort of pull in different directions, right? And when we think of modal disagreement, clearly this is likely going, well, not likely, but possibly will stem from a disagreement in background theories that generated those two right, modal spaces. And so the issue of how those theories were, in some sense, uncovered, and of what kind of wiggle room they afford as sort of roughly right application and sort of erroneous application, right? These are also likely going to matter for sort of cross-theoretic disagreement. And so also for the kind of modal disagreement that stems from that. And so I'm just sort of trying to come full circle to the question of why we should think that there's modal epistemology that's unified and unique and most persuasive from the get-go, instead of just thinking of modal discovery, modal error, and modal disagreement, for instance, as three kinds of issues that are quite distinct.
Mhm.
Thanks.
Yeah, that's a great point. So the conclusion is rather tentative at this point, and I didn't mean it as well. We should just look for this unified account of modal knowledge that solves everything out of blue. It should rather, I'm thinking that one, it should be, it should have been there a realist modal epistemology, because that's important. And the realist modal epistemology should account for facts, for modal facts, and for our knowledge of modal facts, of course. So starting from that, if there really are modal facts that are robust, that are not reducible to other types of to simple empirical facts or to theories, then I should expect to have modal discovery or modal error and modal disagreement that are not explained by falling back on other types of justification or of solving this issue, solving, let's say, a modal disagreement. So my point here was rather that you should have some general way of proceeding, something that explains in a way modal discovery and modal error or modal disagreement, or just one of those if you want to, by not falling back on, let's say, theories or a theoretical background that is not necessarily modal, or that doesn't have doesn't consider modal issues or modal statements or modal truths as fundamental, or as level one, say, of factuality. But that is not to say that I'm hoping that we can find a modal epistemology that solves all or characterizes all. Rather, that we should take into account that there are things such as, or there should be things such as modal discovery, modal error, or modal disagreement that are at this moment explained rather unsatisfactorily, as they're just touched collaterally. As well, maybe you could explain modal disagreement this way or another way, by disagreement between theories that would be very promising, but that is problematic from a realist standpoint, because maybe that's the conceptual underpinnings of the theory that makes modal disagreement, and not the factual nature of those theories, and so on. But I'm not, to sum up, because I'm rambling a bit, I'm not thinking or wanting to impose such a strong restriction on the successfulness of modal epistemology. Of course, it cannot solve any disagreement in any type of context, but it should do a little bit more in order to characterize these different situations, and to show why they are to some extent different than regular discovery or regular error and regular disagreements, let's call them, all the while remaining factual.
All right, thanks so much, Mihai. Plenty of food for thought there. I think I might have a few follow-ups, but I'll gladly defer to Corina. Corina, if you'd like to ask a question, please go ahead. I might have been under a misapprehension. I thought Corina raised her hand. My apologies if you didn't mean to ask a question. I believe that Paula also wanted to chime in. Paula, if you'd like, we're all ears. Please go ahead.
Thank you. First of all, thank you, Mihai, for your talk. It was awesome. I do have because when I hear realist point of view when it comes to model facts, you said something like possible truths are knowable. You said something like that at one point. And I was thinking, what about a negation of an impossible fact? For example, it should be a necessary truth, so it has to be knowable. But how can we know that's truth, for example? I don't know how to say it.
How do you
having
have access?
knowledge
How
about
do you
all
have an
possible words?
epistemic access to, let's say, a negation of an impossible truth, as
Yeah,
long
something
as
like
we,
that.
as long as we don't, we cannot grasp the impossible truth. Yeah? Well, that's a very, very sensible and subtle point. But there are what you call impossible words in the literature. Daniel Nolan and other authors that appeal to impossible words. You have counterpossible antecedents to counterfactuals and so on. So impossible antecedents to counterfactuals. Sorry. As for me, I don't think that it's impossible to understand an impossible truth. You cannot know that impossible truth because it cannot be true, but I think you can understand it. You can understand the contradiction to some extent. Of course, that raises a host of other issues. What does it mean to understand a contradiction or something that is impossible? So maybe let's not jump to contradictions, to logical contradictions. Let's come to biological impossibilities or to physical impossibilities and so on. It would not be, I don't think that that's really a problem understanding impossible biological truths. I know that mammals lay eggs or something like that, or an impossible physical statement, sorry, or impossible physical claim, not truth. And if you can understand that some way or another, the problem is not to understand it perfectly or adequately, just to understand it at some point. I think you can understand the negation of an impossible truth. It's rather harder for logical impossibilities. I think that's why I think we should distinguish between different forms of modal truth. But I don't see a problem with, first of all, understanding impossibilities, and then understanding negation of impossibilities and knowing them as they are true.
But how do you make the jump from just understanding to knowing something? Because that was my problem. And of course, I was thinking about logical impossibilities. Sorry, I was not thinking about metaphysical ones.
Mm-hmm. Well, I could use the easier way out and just say that my talk is about metaphysical modal concepts. Well, at this point, I must say I don't see a problem with that because, well, typically you can just play with negation in many different ways, and some negations of logical impossibilities, well, yeah, that's an arduous problem. However, it's a rather difficult one. But at some point, they may be equivalent to more simple and controversial logical truths, no? And you can understand them via an equivalent truth, maybe, or know them via an equivalent truth, I think. I must just have to say that I don't see a problem with that, because you don't need to understand, you don't need to know everything that is related to a certain truth you know. You just need to understand in some way the various other claims that may be related, such as the negation of that claim and so on, or the claim that is negated by the claim that you understand and know. Now, the way you understand that is a bit problematic, and many of the accounts in the literature are, let's say, deficient on this point also. I don't know if I'm clear enough. I'm a little tired, but how to put this better? The simple idea, the gist is that you might have a propositional form, a simple form of understanding. You might have more complex, let's call it, way of understanding imagination. You have propositional imagination, then you have pictorial imagination or representations and so on that encompass or contain more aspects or dimensions. I think you can, there's not a problem of just adding a minimal requirement of understanding the impossible, the logical impossible truth, I think, and then just going from there to the knowledge of the necessary truth that is the negation of the impossibility. I, for one, don't see a problem with that, but some other people may see it. It's just a minimal propositional understanding of this impossibility. And some may claim that you can understand also logical contradictions and you can imagine them even to some extent. But that imagination may be only propositional or very minimal as to what it concerns.
Thank you.
All right, thanks so much, Paula, for the question, and Mihai for answering. I would have a quick follow-up to Paula's question, I think. Or maybe it's just something bit different that I didn't fully grasp from the talk, Mihai. I was wondering, you spent quite a bit of time talking about practices for ascertaining counterfactual dependencies, right? And just throwback to the 1960s, right? When we think of counterfactuals, say Lewis style or Stalnaker style, typically counterfactual conditionals are variable conditionals. And so there's going to be the inner modality and the outer modality, right? And so is there any need or any special requirement or desideratum for treating these two modalities on a par? So couldn't, I guess this is the upshot, couldn't we consider modal knowledge to be characterized in different epistemic terms when it comes to the inner and the outer modalities for the counterfactual in questions, right? So just to take a simple example, could I win a 400-yard running race, right? Well, not right now, right? When it comes to my current physical state, I couldn't do it unless the competitors were lamer than I am. But when it comes to whether it's genuinely possible were I to now try to begin to go into training, to have some kind of to be on a diet, to have this goal vivid in my mind, and sort of pursue it whole hog, right? Could I win a 400-yard running race? Well, maybe, right? And so there seems to be a modal wiggle room there. And so perhaps, and this is just very tentative and very half-baked, and I'm waiting for you to tell me why this is wrong, but perhaps we don't need to treat the two respective modalities in the same way. And so this raises some perhaps foundational questions about how to best understand our heterogeneous practices in identifying and working with and reasoning with counterfactual dependencies. So I wonder what you think. Thanks.
Well, that is a great question, actually, and I'm certainly not willing to tell you that you are wrong, because I hold, let's say, similar views to the extent that I have developed views on these issues. Yeah, of course we could. I have no qualm with that, or no problem with that. It's just that we need to establish which of the models we can apply or should be applied in the case of metaphysical modality. So that was, if you want, a take-home message, a point that I am always eager to follow up on and to insist on. And that's not established in Williamson's account, but it could be developed or accounted for or used in there are different counterfactual accounts on the epistemology of modality. The most famous one being Boris Mentz, which is rather different from Williamson's. I don't see a problem with that or with your view, but I should think that at least in the way laymen develop counterfactual suppositions and counterfactual dependencies, I think that an outer model, a distant type, distant words model, works better for the most part of, for most counterfactual suppositions. And my problem here is, if you want, very small. Yeah, it's a flimsy and small problem here. I just want Williamson to tell us which model should we apply and based on what. On what types of intuitions and on what type of evidence we would apply the outer or the inner model of counterfactuals to the epistemology of modality. Because as I see it, he wants to apply the stricter model, the stricter view, where you will always have a certain stock of constitutive truths, and from then on things are decided, if you want, by those constitutive truths. And I'm not sure that that's the way to go. Perhaps a more permissive account of counterfactuals or epistemology of counterfactuals characterizes some uses, or perhaps the most widely encountered uses of model notions. But again, these are only intuitions and speculations. I think we should investigate more on the actual use of model expressions and of model notions, includingly in philosophical accounts, but not only in that.
All right, thank you so much, Mihai. And I wonder if Paolo Covina might have a new question. If not, let me just bug you with one very quick last question. I look at your slide here, and referring to Williamson, you say much more needs to be done to study, this is a quote from you, to study actual practices and norms for fruitful linguistic exchanges using modal expressions, and also how modal thinking is shaped and used. And then talking about layman, you talk about modal thinking and discourse, right? And there seems, at least on the face of it, and correct me if I'm wrong once again, there seems to be a marked difference between putatively modal thought and putatively modal linguistic exchanges. And I say that because typically different people can imagine different things. And I think this is fairly uncontroversial. Also, different people have different conceptual repertoires. And so, and you might hesitate here, different people might conceive of different things. And so there, to the extent that there is this kind of individual thinker autonomy in some sense with respect to what one can imagine or conceive or deem to be possible in some sense, where the deeming is somehow doxastic or epistemic or whatever. The linguistic exchanges between individual interlocutors who are themselves autonomous thinkers would in some sense emerge from that, or in some sense rely on that. And of course, there are also some kind of unifying pressures so that perhaps people will tend to conceive and imagine of what will in some sense enhance their communication. But that seems to be very rough and ready, and there seems to be no sort of constraint that's in some sense that couldn't be bypassed or flouted in a sense. And so I wonder if there isn't this kind of disconnect between communication that uses modal phrases on the one hand, verbal communication, and on the other hand, the modal thought that each of the interlocutors is in some sense displaying or exhibiting or sort of going through. And if that's the case, then it would, again, Nafokhtiogi also seemed that different epistemological takes will suit language and thought better. And so once again, I'm sort of, wondering if the epistemology of modality isn't this kind of deeply disjunctive project. And so I just wonder if you'd like to say a few words about
Well,
that.
it might be. It might be just that, and I may veer into the direction of what you have just sort of defined or discussed just before. I'm thinking about these issues. So at no point am I saying that modal epistemology generally should be this way or another way, and that I'm not implying that there is a strong connection between the way we use modal expressions and modal thought. We should think that modal thought should be rather more serious, let's call it stricter, more restricted than linguistic exchanges. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a relation between the two, and there shouldn't be some sort of clarification, more clarification on this issue and on these issues and on these relations. So there is one point that I made earlier that I would like to repeat here. It's about realist epistemologies, modal epistemologies in particular, and I contend that there is a problem and a preoccupation for the realist, the ontological realist, about modality at the moment where she, or as Williamson does, where Williamson, in his account of understanding, he insists that, well, understanding is minimal. You just have to take part in some fruitful linguistic exchanges using those expressions. You're a part of a community of speakers, etc. Now, when we apply the same type of thinking to modal expressions, that's where I see the problem, and that's why your comment or your question actually rings true, or is quite interesting for me, and I tend to agree with it, because it seems to me that, well, perhaps at the end, maybe you will find out that not much. You cannot extract much from the actual practices and norms for fruitful linguistic exchanges regarding modal expressions. And you should distinguish maybe between understanding regular expressions, let's say, and modal expressions, or metaphysical modal expressions on the one hand, and talk about specialized expert use and try to I don't know, talk in those terms and define modality in those terms. But we're at the point where not much has been done to, let's say, separate things and to clarify these issues and to study the various connections that may exist between linguistic use and modal thinking. Or at least the literature is not certain, maybe extensively, when we talk about modal epistemology. So I'm very much on your side, or on the way you described, on the side of the way you described things just now. But any answer on one side or another, I contend, cannot be done without a little more research into this purported connection between modal thinking and linguistic exchanges. There might be a very flimsy notion of modality that we may extract from linguistic exchanges with modal expressions or using modal expressions, but that serves my point, because my point was exactly that regarding Williamson, that his restrictions seem a little too strong on counterfactual suppositions and developments. And while they may give us just the right modal concept, the modal concept we want, they may not characterize our practice or, I don't know, people's practice in counterfactual developments. So yeah, that's an issue that has to be solved, however, by doing more than armchair philosophy, I think.
Or at least by doing more of it. Thank you so much, Mihai. This has been quite outstanding. You've successfully lived up to a barrage of questions, and we're very grateful for a fantastic talk. Thanks so much to Paula and Corina for um, their sustained presence here, and looking forward to new events. Don't forget, Mihai is also giving a talk on June 2nd in Alex's workshop on the epistemology of modality, and we're all very much looking forward to that. Mihai, thanks once again, and to everyone, have a good night.
Thank you for having me.